I am Mike D, and this is the history of money, banking, and trade. Here's what I want you to think about. Every financial system you interact with today, every bank, every currency, every credit arrangement is the product of thousands of years of human ingenuity, necessity, and occasionally spectacular failure. This podcast is the story of how it all began, evolved, and became the world we lived in. We're starting in the ancient world, and we're not stopping until we reach the present. Welcome aboard. Before we get into the archaeology, the treaties, and the slow grinding machinery of Roman political history, we need to go back to the very beginning. Not the historical beginning, we'll get to that, but the story Romans told themselves about where they came from, because those stories matter. They just don't tell you what a civilization believed about its past. They tell you what it believed about itself. And the story Rome told about its founding is one of the most revealing origin myths in all of human history. It starts, as so many things in the ancient Mediterranean do, with Troy. The Romans traced their origins back to a Trojan prince named Aeneas, son of the goddess Venus herself, one of the few survivors of the Greek destruction of Troy. Rather than accepting defeat, Aeneas gathered his troops, loaded his ships, and spent years wandering the Mediterranean in search of a new home. Think of it as the Trojan version of Exodus, a chosen people, divinely guided, searching for land that they were meant to inherit. He eventually landed in Italy, married into the local Latin aristocracy, and founded a city called Lavinium. His descendants went on to rule Alba Longa, establishing a royal dynasty that would eventually produce two boys that would change the world. These boys were Romulus and Remus. They didn't arrive into a world gently. Their mother, Rhea Silvia, was a Vestal virgin, forced into that role by her uncle, a usurper named Aemilius, who had overthrown her father, Numitor, from the throne of Alba Longa. Making her a Vestal virgin was Aemilius' insurance policy. Vestal virgins couldn't have children. No children meant no heirs. No heirs meant no rival claims to the throne. What Aemilius hadn't accounted for was the god Mars. According to the myth, Mars visited Rhea Silvia, and she became pregnant with twin boys. When Aemilius discovered this, he did what insecure tyrants throughout history have done when they faced a threat that they cannot control. He tried to eliminate it before it could grow. He ordered the infants to be thrown into the Tiber River. As servants in ancient myths so often do, didn't quite follow through. Instead of drowning the twins, they placed them in a basket and sent them adrift. This basket came to rest at the foot of the Palatine hill, the same hill that would later sit at the heart of the greatest city in the ancient world, beneath a big fig tree called the Ficus Ruminalis. And here is where the story takes a turn that Romans would place on their coins, their scriptures, and even their monuments for centuries. A she-wolf found the infants and nursed them. Not a farmer's wife, not a kindly shepherd who happened to be passing by. A wild predator, the apex of the Italian landscape, the animal Romans associated with Mars himself, the god of war. The image of the she-wolf crouching over the two boys, feeding them with their own body, became one of the most enduring symbols in the history of Western civilization. If you've ever seen the famous bronze sculpture known as the Capitoline Wolf, you've seen what Rome wanted the world to see when it looked at its origins. Eventually, a shepherd named Faustulus discovered the boys and raised them as his own. They grew up strong, capable, and with no idea who they really were. When the truth emerged, as it always does in these stories, They didn't cower. They marched back to Alba Longa, overthrew Romulus, and restored their grandfather Numitor to his rightful throne. And then they looked around and thought, we should build something of our own. They set out to found a new city. And this is where the myth takes its darkest turn. The turn that says more about Rome than any other part of the story. The brothers disagreed about where to build, about who would lead, and about who the gods had truly chosen. Romulus standing on Palatine Hill, Remus on the Aventine, each watching the sky for divine signs. Remus saw 6 vultures, Romulus saw 12. But what those signs meant, and who had been truly favored, they could not agree on. The disputes escalated. In some versions of the story, Remus mocked his brother by jumping over the partially built walls of Romulus's new city, a gesture of contempt for what Romulus was trying to create. In all versions, the outcome is the same. Romulus killed his brother, and from that act of fratricide, on that blood-soaked hill, Rome was born in 553 BCE. Romulus became its first king, and the city took his name. Now take a moment with that. Most civilizations construct founding myths designed to maximize their own virtue. They choose founding fathers who are noble, self-sacrificing, and divinely pure. The Greeks had Prometheus bringing fire to humanity. The Hebrews had Moses leading his people out of slavery. Even stories that involve violence tend to sanitize it, or frame it as the necessary destruction of a clear evil. Rome chose a fratricide. Not accidentally, not as an embarrassing detail they tried to paper over. Rome knew the story. They told it to their children. They put it in their poetry. They commissioned statues of the she-wolf. And right there at the center of it, they left the murder of Remus unsanitized, unexplained, and unredeemed. Why? Because the myth wasn't designed to make Rome look innocent. It was designed to make Rome look inevitable. The violence isn't a flaw in the founding. It is the founding. Rome was not born from consensus, or compromise, or even peaceful negotiation. It was born from the willingness to do whatever was necessary, including the unthinkable, in service of something larger. The divine lineage, descended from Venus through Aeneas, fathered a mortal woman by Mars himself, placed Rome in the company of the gods. The she-wolf placed Rome in the company of predators, and the killing of Remus placed Rome in a moral universe where greatness and ruthlessness were not opposites. They were the same thing, seen from different angles. The Romans were remarkably self-aware about this. They did not deny their monarchical origins. They didn't pretend that the Republic had sprung up from pristine democratic tradition. They looked at the blood on their foundation and said, yes, that's us. That's where we came from. And from that foundation, we built the greatest city the world has ever seen. Whether that is something to admire or something to be troubled by is a question worth sitting with. Because in a very real sense, every war Rome has ever fought, every empire built, every rival it ever destroyed, Carthage, Corinth, the Hellenistic kingdoms, and eventually its own republic, all traces back to that moment on Palatine Hill. Rome was always going to be Rome. The myth just told you so from the very first line. The founding myth was a beautiful story that gets at the heart of what Romans wanted to be. The reality was considerably more modest. The earliest dated Roman settlement occupied Palatine Hill and likely originated in the 14th century BCE, though earlier habitation remains speculative given the limits of excavation. Archaeological evidence Particularly, the small number of graves suggests these early villages were tiny, probably no more than 100 inhabitants. The largest settlement emerged on Palatine Hill, which appears to have drawn people from the surrounding communities because of its role as a local trade center. Even the most ancient societies will settle where the money is. In this case, that meant the exchange of goods through commodities acting as proto-monies. These hills were chosen for practical geographic reasons: proximity to the sea, access to fresh water from the Tiber River, natural defensive advantages, and a central position at major crossroads, later reflected in the saying that all roads lead to Rome. Despite these insights, evidence for the broader societies of pre-Roman Italy remains limited. Before Rome was Rome, there was Etruria. Etruria occupied what is now roughly modern-day Tuscany, and is home to the Etruscans, the most influential civilization in Italy before Rome's rise. If you want to understand where Rome came from culturally, institutionally, and aesthetically, the Etruscans are your answer. The greatest concentration of pro-urban settlements in pre-Rome Italy wasn't in Latium, where Rome would eventually rise. It was in Etruria. Before the 7th century BCE onward, the emergence of an aristocratic class in the Etruscan society drove something remarkable. There was planned urban development, true cities with organized street grids, drainage systems, temples, and civic spaces. The people of the Indus Valley had done this around 2600 BCE, so the Etruscans weren't the first. But they were building sophisticated urban environments at a time when Rome was still a collection of hilltop villages. The question that many would ask is, well, who were the Etruscans? This is generally one of the more interesting questions in ancient history, and the honest answer is we still really aren't entirely sure. What we do know is that they were not Latin. Their language was non-Indo-European, completely unrelated to Latin, Greek, or any of the other major language families of the ancient Mediterranean. We can read the letters because they used a Greek-derived alphabet, but the meaning of the text remains obscure to this day. The ancient tradition, going back to Herodotus, held that the Etruscans originally migrated from Asia Minor, what is now Western Turkey. For centuries, that was the accepted explanation. But modern genetic and archaeological research has complicated that picture considerably, and the current scholarship leans towards the Etruscans being an indigenous Italian population that was shaped by outside influence rather than wholesale migration. But the origin question still remains largely open to new research, so the consensus could change anytime soon. What is not in dispute is their influence over Rome. Several of Rome's legendary kings, including Tarquinius Priscus and Tarquinius Superbus, the last king whose expulsion supposedly triggered the Republic, were Etruscan or of Etruscan origin. Etruscan architecture techniques, religious practices, civic symbols, and aristocratic traditions all flowed into Rome during the formative period. And the Etruscans served as cultural intermediaries, transmitting Greek influence, art, mythology, philosophy, and the alphabet itself northward and westward throughout Italy. Archaeological evidence from sites like the temple area of St. Homobonus in Rome, dating to around 600 BCE, reveals exactly this kind of cultural blending. Etruscan architectural forms combined with Greek stylistic influences, reflecting the trade networks and the cultural exchanges that characterized central Italy during this period. And the one thing about trade that is often not fully understood or fully appreciated, for that matter, is you're not just exchanging goods, but instead you're exchanging ideas, you're exchanging science, you're exchanging mathematics. There's so many exchanges that happen, whether it's physical goods or ideology or scholarship, that I feel is often underappreciated. The Etruscans were, in short, Rome's first great teachers. And then Rome outgrew them, absorbed them, and eventually forgot to give them credit. Rome began as a monarchy. This is not disputed. What is disputed is almost everything else about this early period. Roman tradition preserved the memory of the seven kings, stretching from Romulus in 753 BCE to Tarquinius Superbus, whose expulsion in 509 BCE traditionally marks the founding of the Republic. It's a tidy story. The problem is, the archaeological evidence for these specific kings is essentially non-existent. The names, dates, and deeds preserved in Roman tradition reflect later literary reconstruction as much as genuine historical memory. The further you go back, the thinner the evidence becomes. What the archaeological and cultural record does support is a period of deep Etruscan influence over early Rome, not through violent conquest, but through cultural and political penetration. Rome during the monarchy period was, in many respects, an Etruscan-influenced city. The expulsion of the Tarquinius was as much a repudiation of that Etruscan cultural dominance as it was a rejection of monarchy itself. The fall of the monarchy is, as one historian put it, as much myth as history, but its political consequences were entirely real. The word rex, which is king, became one of the most toxic terms in Roman political vocabulary. Romans didn't pretend that they never had kings. They knew they had. But they transformed that monarchical past into cautionary legend and built a ferocious cultural reflex against any return to it. This right there is worth sitting with. The Romans were not naive about their own history. They looked at the monarchy, absorbed its lessons, and decided that the concentration of absolute power in a single person was the road to tyranny. And they built an entire political system designed to prevent it. That system was the Republic. The Roman Republic is traditionally dated from 509 BCE, the year that Tarquinius Superbus was expelled and replaced by two annually elected councils. The basic design was elegant in its logic. Take the powers that belong to a king and split them between two men, elected for 1 year only, each with the power to veto the other. The councils retain substantial authority, military command in the field, political leadership in Rome, and the right to convene the Senate and the assemblies. What they lost was preeminence and singularity. No council could act without the implicit threat of his colleague's veto. No council could build a personal power base across multiple years. And when their year ended, they were private citizens again, subject to the same laws they had enforced. Roman timekeeping itself reflected this system in a wonderfully concrete way. Romans didn't number their years the way we do. They named them after the consuls serving in that year. If you want to date something precisely, you said it happened in the year of so-and-so council. The official record of consular names was publicly displayed and carefully maintained. The calendar was the constitution that was made visible. It's also worth noting the historical coincidence that was probably not entirely coincidental. That Rome's transition away from tyranny happened roughly at the same time with Athens' liberation from the tyrant Hippias around 510 BCE. Two city-states at the opposite ends of the Mediterranean, moving in a similar direction at similar times, but they arrived at different destinations. Athens developed democracy, direct participation of citizens in governance. But it's also worth noting that democracy in Athens was not the type of democracy that we associate with today, because in Athens, roughly a third of the people were slaves, they couldn't vote, and the women couldn't vote, and if you were not born of Athenian parents, you couldn't vote. So only the citizens could vote, which kind of eliminated quite a few of the people, really, in all honesty. Rome developed a republic, a system of shared governance among the elite. It was theoretically accountable to the broader citizen body, but never truly democratic in the Athenian sense. That dysfunction would shape Western political philosophy for 2,000 years. Now, before we get into the specific machinery of Roman class and status, there's a larger truth worth stating plainly. Across every phase of Roman history, whether it's the monarchy, republic, or empire, political power was concentrated in the hands of a narrow elite defined by wealth, and in its earlier phases, by hereditary status. At the system's height during the imperial period, a ruling class of perhaps 10,000 senators and senior equestrians administered an empire of somewhere between 50 and 70 million people. That ratio of a few thousand decision makers over tens of millions of subjects tells you something fundamental about what Rome was. Not necessarily a democracy or a meritocracy. An oligarchy sophisticated enough to incorporate talented outsiders when it needed to, brutal enough to crush threats to its position when it had to, and durable enough to sustain itself across nearly 1,000 years of continuous operation. Understanding that is the foundation for understanding everything else. During the Republic, the Senate had no formal written property qualifications for membership. No law specified the minimum wealth threshold. This in itself surprises people because senators were obviously and overwhelmingly wealthy. But the enforcement of that expectation was procedural rather than statutory. And here's how it worked. After a man completed a senior magistracy, which was the standard entry point into the senatorial order, he would be placed on the senatorial roll call by censors. The censors were magistrates elected every 5 years whose job was to review civic membership. They would assess property values and maintain the integrity of Roman institutions. The Senate itself played no role in admitting its own members. You did not campaign. You served as a quaestor, and the censors enrolled you. The censors also had the power to remove sitting senators, ostensibly for moral failings, though in practice this authority was frequently deployed for political purposes. A man who was too visibly poor, too scandalous, or too inconvenient could find himself struck from the roll. This gave the census enormous discretionary power over senatorial composition without any of it being written into formal law. When the Republic gave way to the Empire, the mechanics shifted fundamentally. Augustus imposed a formal property qualification of 1 million sesterces for senatorial membership, codifying in law what had previously been a customary expectation. In doing so, he was largely formalizing existing practices, but writing them into law was characteristically Augustan, which Augustan would become to known as conservative in appearance and transformative in effect. The Senate had become, in a meaningful sense, an instrument of imperial governance rather than an independent deliberative body. At the apex of the Roman society sat the patricians, the hereditary descendants of Rome's earliest ruling families, whose ancestral claims stretched back to the founding of the city itself. Patrician status was a matter of birth, full stop. You could not buy it, earn it, or marry into it directly. And patrician families reinforced their exclusivity through genealogy. Many traced their lineages not to the distinguished Romans, but to the gods and heroes. Julius Caesar's family, the Julii, claimed descendants from Aeneas himself, and through Aeneas from the goddess Venus. This was not unique to Caesar. Many prominent patrician families maintained similar claims, using legendary genealogies to connect themselves to Rome's mythical past. Whether individual Romans fully believed these genealogies or treated them as useful political mythology probably varied from person to person. But the claims were made, maintained, and taken seriously enough to matter politically. I can only imagine that a certain portion of the population, when they hear that a patrician is related to some god some 1,000 years prior, I can imagine a lot of them just probably roll their eyes, and then other people really truly believe it. In a weird way, I kind of see it how religious figures nowadays claim certain things, certain of the population believes it and wants to fully accept it, and other people just kind of roll their eyes and say this is ridiculous. So this really depends on where you are, probably politically and spiritually, for that matter. But here's the interesting wrinkle. Being patrician didn't guarantee being wealthy. By the late Republic, hereditary prestige had become particularly decoupled from actual financial power. Julius Caesar's own family is the perfect example. The Julii Caesars were impeccably patrician. You couldn't get more old Roman than that bloodline. But by Caesar's generation, the family fortune had declined significantly. Caesar inherited a family of faded political power and political ambition in roughly equal measure. By the time he was positioning himself for a major command, he was carrying debts that ancient sources estimated as staggering sums, financed largely by Marcus Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome, who saw Caesar as a political investment. Caesar's desperation for Gallic command was not simply about glory, it was about financial survival. Military command meant plunder. Plunder meant paying off his debts. Paying off his debts meant surviving in Roman politics long enough to matter. The Gallic Wars, which made Caesar's reputation and ultimately his political destiny, were also, in the most basic level, a financial rescue operation. It's a very human story underneath all the marble and the laurel crowns. Below the patricians, and eventually below the broader senatorial class, came the equestrians, which were the Roman knights. The name comes from their original military function. In the early centuries of Rome, the equestrians were men wealthy enough to provide a horse for military service. This wealth requirement was set at 400,000 sesterces, reflecting the cost of maintaining horses and the equipment that went with them. But by the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE, the equestrian order had evolved far beyond its military origins. These were no longer primarily horsemen. They were financiers, the tax farmers, the state contractors, and the provincial administrators who made the Roman economic machine function. While senators were ideologically and legally constrained from direct involvement in long-distance commerce, equestrians faced no such restrictions. They filled a space senators couldn't occupy, and that space was enormous. The Palatine, or the equestrian tax farming companies, bid for contracts to collect provincial revenues, keeping a share as profits. State contractors for road construction, military supply, temple building, and public works flowed through equestrian hands. When the empire needed something financed, built, collected, or managed, it turned to the equestrian order. The equestrian order was also not a sealed aristocracy. Wealth was the primary qualification, and wealth could be accumulated. A successful merchant, a prosperous contractor, a fortunate financier could over time accumulate the 400,000 sesterces that would qualify him or his sons for equestrian status. It was one of the more genuine avenues of upward mobility in Roman society, which was limited, contingent on substantial success, but it was real. It's worth naming something directly. The Palatini were, in modern economic terms, rent seekers. Their primary function was extracting wealth from provincial taxpayers rather than generating new productive value. They were the rent-seeking middlemen that offer really no service except for extraction. They were widely despised across the Roman world. The Gospel's consistent association of tax collectors with sinners reflected a Mediterranean-wide cultural attitude towards this class that had been building for centuries. And these were also the same people that were despised in prior periods. So if you go back to Sumer or Babylonia, you have these tax farmers that were doing the same thing. So this is nothing new. This has been something that's been going around for thousands of years. And they all did basically the same thing. They would bid on a contract to collect tax for the government because the government saw this as a risk mitigation tool. So they knew that they can get an X amount of taxes for a particular region, and they didn't have to worry about coming up short. So they would get the money that was paid to them directly by the person or the family, or maybe even a group of investors, and the government said, okay, good, we got our money. Now they would go out and they collect the money, but they would always collect more than they would have given the government, so they made a profit. In doing so, they will often use heavy-handed techniques. So they would be shaking down people and really making it very tough for people that lived in a particular area, because if they had just given their money directly to the government, they would have saved a lot of money. Instead, these rent-seeking middlemen came in and basically made their lives much harder than it already was by collecting too much in taxes, too much in rent, if you want to look at it that way. But it's also worth noting that in the Roman society, that this contempt didn't make them less powerful. It also may have made them more so, because they operated in an economic space that senators couldn't touch and that the ordinary merchants couldn't access. The equestrian class also developed what we might call proto-corporate institutions. The Societas Publicanorum, the companies formed to bid on state tax contracts, which were pooled capital from multiple investors, which distributed risk and maintained a legal identity somewhat distinct from their individual members. Shares in these companies could be bought and sold. They had something resembling a board of directors. They were not corporations in the modern sense, but they were the closest thing the ancient world produced to joint stock commercial entities. The lineage from Phoenician merchant networks through Carthaginian commercial innovation through Roman societies to trading companies of the early modern period is long and direct, but it is very real. Below the equestrians came the plebeians, and here's where it's important to correct a widespread misconception immediately. The plebeians were not uniformly poor. The legal category of plebeian encompassed virtually everyone who wasn't patrician, which meant it included everyone from impoverished urban laborers to wealthy merchants to politically powerful families whose members had held senior magistracies for generations. By the late Republic, the political distinction between patrician and plebeian had become largely ceremonial for elite families, since the conflict of the orders had long since opened up most of the major offices to wealthy plebeians. The urban poor, or the plebs urbana, were a different matter. Concentrated in Rome's crowded apartment blocks, dependent on the grain dough, forming the volatile crowds of the Roman political life, they were the constituency that the populist politicians courted and conservative senators managed. Their poverty was real, and their real political leverage, though limited, was not non-existent. Rome's history is punctuated by moments when the urban poor made their presence felt in ways the Senate could not ignore. Below the plebeians, in terms of social status, were the freedmen, formerly enslaved people who had been manumitted and were now legally free. Their position was generally complex. Legally free, yes. Socially stigmatized, absolutely. Barred from the most senior offices, but economically and often surprisingly successful. The trades, crafts, and commercial activities that formed the backbone of Rome's urban economy were heavily populated by freedmen and their descendants. One detail about freedmen that tends to get overlooked, but matters enormously, was the disabilities of freedmen status applied to only one generation. The children of freedmen were free-born Roman citizens with no formal legal stigmas attached to their parents' servitude. This made Roman manumission a significant engine of social mobility across generations. And it distinguished Rome's system from the hereditary racial slavery of more recent historical periods in important ways. In other words, these were not chattel slaves that you see in the American South and the Caribbean. And then from there, at the foundation of everything else, were the enslaved people. Scholars estimate that between 10 and 30% of the total population of the Roman Empire were enslaved, with the proportion significantly higher in Italy and major cities, where estimates range from 20 to 40%. These numbers carry genuine uncertainty, as ancient demography is an imprecise science, but the order of magnitude is not in serious dispute. Slavery was not a marginal feature of Roman society, it was foundational to the agricultural systems, to urban commerce, to domestic life, to mining operations that produced Roman wealth. Rome's system of slavery was very similar to that of Athens slavery, in that proportionally the population was enslaved in similar percentages, and the enslaved population was largely responsible for the backbone of their economic engine, in both cases, whether it's Rome or Athens. Rome's slave economy was one of the largest in human history, which was exceeded only in scale by the plantation system of the early modern Atlantic world. One distinction worth noting, unlike plantation slavery in the Americas, Roman slavery carried no sense that certain people were naturally inferior and therefore destined to be enslaved. Instead, slavery was seen as a misfortune that could happen to anyone. A slave might be in every way superior to his or her master, smarter, more educated, with finer judgment. The master might even acknowledge this openly. It was a different moral universe from what came later, though no less brutal for it. In taking a step back to earlier slave days of the more ancient world, so we're talking back into Mesopotamia, even Athens and other Greek city-states, it wasn't uncommon for the slaves to be highly educated, and they would teach these slaves to run businesses for the owners. And in some cases, in Athens's case, some slaves ended up becoming the major bankers of the ancient world. So the big difference is, to be clear, is in American chattel system of slavery, they did not want their slaves to have any formal education. They frowned upon it. Well, they actually would beat people for learning how to read. So they would make sure they didn't read. They would take their religion from them, so they made them all Christian because they didn't want them to be associated to their African roots. And they also wanted to make sure that whatever they can do, the chattel slaves in the Americas could never, ever be looked upon as superior in any sort of way. In the ancient world, it just wasn't uncommon for the slaves to be smarter and better trained than their masters. And in some cases, even in parts of Mesopotamia and Athens, they would actually invest heavily into the slaves so they can sell them on the open market, because other people would come and say, hey, your slave, he's a great businessman. He knows how to run your businesses. I want to buy them from you because I want him or her to run my business. So it just wasn't uncommon for something like that to happen. And this would never happen in the Americas whatsoever. But one thing that was similar to the Americas, as in ancient Rome, was slave revolts. The most dramatic slave revolts would have been the Spartacus Rebellion of 73 to 71 BCE, which revealed genuine systemic anxiety about the sustainability of this arrangement. That a single escaped gladiator could raise an army of tens of thousands and hold off Roman legions for 2 years says something about both the desperation of the enslaved and the structural vulnerabilities of a society built on forced labor. In the Americas, one of the biggest fear was that the slaves would revolt and rise up. You get places in the southeast United States where the African population outnumbered the white European population. They were scared that they would eventually rise up. Same thing in the Caribbean, places like Haiti. They were always worried, and rightfully so, because sometimes they did have slave rebellions and lots of people were killed. Now, here's where it gets a little interesting. So I'm going to take a step back. In 218 BCE, the same year Hannibal was crossing the Alps, a law was passed that revealed something profound about how Roman elite culture actually worked. It was called Lex Claudia. It prohibited senators and their sons from owning ships with cargo capacities greater than 300 amphorae. To give you a sense of the scale, Roman amphorae were the standard shipping containers of the ancient world. They were two-handed clay vessels used to transport wine, olive oil, fish sauce, and grain across the Mediterranean. A ship carrying 300 amphorae was a small coastal vessel. Anything large enough for serious long-distance maritime commerce was off limits. The stated rationale was ideological. The Roman senator was supposed to be a landed aristocrat, a man whose wealth came from the earth, great estates producing wheats, wine, and olives. This ideology drew a sharp moral distinction between the senator, rooted, stable, tied to the land, and the merchant, rootless, speculative, and chasing profit across the seas. In practice, the Lex Claudia didn't stop senators from participating in the Roman economy. It redirected how they participated. Long-distance lending remained entirely permissible. A senator could lend money to a trading venture, collect interest on the returns, and maintain a perfectly straight face about having no direct involvement in commerce. Freedmen and slaves managed business operations on behalf of their senatorial patrons. Equestrian intermediaries handled the actual trading, while their wealthy backers maintained plausible deniability. This was not a secret. Everyone knew how it worked. The ideology of the landed aristocrat was a performance that the entire elite class participated in while doing something rather different behind the curtain. The hypocrisy was structural and institutional. What's particularly revealing is the direction of the causation. The Lex Claudia was passed against senatorial opposition. A reform on the senatorial class was from the outside, not a voluntary code of honor or ethics that they had adopted themselves, which tells you something important. Without legal constraint, senators would simply have dominated maritime commerce directly, using their political power to crush equestrian competition. The law created a division of labor between the senators and equestrians by force, not by aristocratic value. The ability to delegate and the art of plausible deniability allowed for the institutional separation of controls from appearance. These were not incidental features of Roman elite life. They were core competencies. The Roman ruling class was, among its other achievements, one of history's great practitioners of structured hypocrisy. And it worked for centuries. Now, all these classes combined that made up the Roman society benefited directly from the minting of coins. But before we get there, it's worth understanding what came before. Among the earliest human societies in Africa, Europe, Mesopotamia, and the Indian subcontinent, the most common form of money was associated with cattle. European tribes before urban life were nomadic herding people with a large number of oxen, cows, and sheep. Cattle were what you had to trade, so cattle became the traditional value standard. In India, from the beginning of the Vedic age, around 2000 to 1400 BCE, the cow was the primary standard of value in trade. The ox appears as a unit of weight in Homer's Greek poems as well. The problem with cattle is obvious in retrospect. You can't divide a cow into smaller units without destroying its value. Livestock is expensive to move and vulnerable to disease and predators. Cattle were useful for exchanging large values, but terrible for the minute transactions of everyday life. Italy, for its part, was a bit behind its Greek counterparts in accepting and minting coins. Prior to coinage, the Romans used forms of credit with payment terms stipulated in agreements, sometimes accepting commodities like grains or metals as settlement. Rome was also known to use salt as a form of payment, or as the story goes, because the idea that Roman soldiers were paid in salt, from which the word salary supposedly derives, has been repeated for centuries, but is not well supported by primary sources. The Latin connection between sal and salt and salarium is real, but most modern scholars believe salarium referred to money given to soldiers to buy salt, not payment in salt itself. Salt was a highly valued commodity in the ancient world, primarily because it was one of the few ways to preserve meat. Pliny the Elder mentions the connection, but the claim that salt itself circulated as currency in Rome lacks solid documentary or archaeological support. The English idiom "worth your salt" may trace back to this idea, though even that origin is uncertain. And one more important point before we get to coins. Credit systems predated coinage everywhere, including Greece. What matters is that credit and money coexisted. rather than one replacing the other. In many places across the ancient Mediterranean, whether it's Rome, Carthage, or the Phoenician city-states, metal ingots served as a form of payment. In Rome, weighing out bronze was the preferred method due to local resource availability. Weighed silver was more common in Carthage and the Eastern Mediterranean. Coins were already in use in Lydia and Greece, but adoption was uneven. The Lydians on Anatolia began minting electrum coins, which is a natural alloy of silver and gold, sometime between 650 to 600 BCE. Greek citizens on the island of Aegina started minting their own coins in the early 600 BCE. Minting took hold more slowly elsewhere. The Phoenicians shifted away from weighed silver and adopted coinage relatively quickly when they started interacting with Greek markets. Carthage minted coins earlier than Rome, but not primarily for commercial reasons. It was to pay Greek mercenaries on Sicily to fight other Greek settlements, including Syracuse. Rome itself introduced standardized bronze coins sometime around 280 to 270 BCE. Silver coinage came even later, following contact with Greek settlements in southern Italy. In 338 BCE, the Latin War ended, and Rome began a period of monetary experimentation. Debt bondage was outlawed around 326 BCE, and then in 269 BCE, the Republic struck its first silver coin to help fund the Punic Wars against Carthage. The basic unit was the denarius, originally worth 10 asses. This was too high a denomination for paying soldiers in everyday transactions, so the most common coin in circulation became the lower value sestertius. Commerce did not create coins, and coins did not create commerce. They simply worked together. Similarly, coins did not give rise to war, slavery, tyranny, or empire. Coinage simply learned, as did art, poetry, and history, to take part. For much of the Roman world, the center of minting operations was at the Temple of Juno Moneta on the Palatine hill overlooking the Roman Forum. The temple itself served as a vault, fusing finance with Roman religion in ways that was entirely characteristic of the ancient world. You see something similar in ancient Athens as well. Moneta was derived from the Latin monere, meaning to warm. She was the patroness of the city. From her name, we have derived the English words for money and mint, although the Romans themselves used the term pecunia for money. The mint at Juno Moneta was a near constant operation. By the 2nd century BCE, Rome was awash in unprecedented wealth, coming primarily from exploiting mines and conquering lands, from forced tributes, and from the minting operations itself. The Roman monetary system, building on the Greek monetary system, penetrated the entire world except China. The ubiquity of Roman coins assimilated new territories into the empire and extended the reach of the market economy, a process usually initiated by paying Rome's conquering legionaries in cash. When Rome adopted coinage, it adopted a bimetallic system of gold and silver. But gold was extremely rare in the early republic, so gold coin circulation was sporadic at best. By the time of Caesar, more gold and silver was flowing into Rome from plunder and mining. A ratio of roughly 11.5 to 1 was established, meaning 11.5 units of silver were equivalent to 1 unit of gold. These ratios were not fixed by law in any modern sense. They fluctuated with the supply coming in from conquest and mining outputs. Later, they would fluctuate further due to debasement. Caesar himself tried to peg these ratios for political reasons. He needed to pay his armies, stabilize state finances, and centralize monetary authority in what was becoming an empire. Whether he also stood to benefit from it personally from controlling the gold to silver ratio is more speculative, but it's worth noting that monetary policy and personal political advantage were rarely cleanly separated in the Roman world. Sadly, in the United States, it's a similar thing that's kind of happening now. So we have a president in charge who has a monetary policy that will personally benefit him and his cronies. And this is something, I guess, that's always been around, but now it's just more public and out in the open and way more corrupt than it's ever been. Rome ultimately controlled the mining of coins and even controlled some of the major mines in Spain, which was land formerly held by Carthage before the Punic Wars, along with Dacia. The reason Rome was able to start minting coins at such scale was pretty straightforward. It plundered from other regions, so it took their gold and silver, and along with forced tributes from allies, which injected newly minted coins into circulation through soldiers' pay, civil servants' wages, and senatorial payments. Roman monetization followed conquest, not internal market developments. This expansion was really the whole point. Rome slowly morphed into a war machine designed for the exploitation and extraction of resources, which were the precious metals that were used to melt down into coins, along with taxation policies designed to encourage conquered populations to adopt coinage in their everyday transactions. Rome did not develop coinage to enable markets. It used markets to sustain conquest. Coinage was a fiscal weapon, not an organic commercial innovation. After Rome transitioned from a republic to the empire, coinage became concentrated in two main zones: Italy itself and the imperial frontiers, where most of the Roman soldiers were stationed. In regions lacking both mines and permanent military garrisons, monetary circulation remained limited, and older credit-based systems appear to have continued largely unchanged. The Republic struggled to maintain the integrity of the denarius and frequently ran out of cash, forcing rulers to rely on borrowing from senators and other wealthy people engaged in private lending. This encouraged currency reforms and the issuance of new, higher-value denominations, such as the gold aureus. Rome needed to mint large amounts of silver to support its growing armies. After the Punic Wars, a profound reform of the currency had to be undertaken, which was an early example of the pendulum swing between quality versus quantity, value and inflation that would recur throughout the monetary history. The first step was centralizing silver minting in Rome itself, issuing a new uniform silver denarius. Provincial mints were largely suppressed, reduced to emitting only bronze coins. The Romans did not fully possess the discipline of the Greek elites in maintaining silver values. After emergency devaluations, the quality of the reformed silver mintage was generally maintained for more than 200 years. Rome's famous public buildings were partially paid through controlled devaluations. The state minted the necessary coins, making some construction virtually free from its own perspective. The temptation of debasement, while generally held at bay for a couple hundred centuries in Rome itself, was strongly felt in the outlying areas that retained their bronze minting rights. Eventually, the Republic would start to crack under the pressure of its own contradictions. Military commanders with personal armies, senators drowning in debt, and a monetary system straining to hold together an empire that had grown faster than the institutions meant to govern it. But that's a story for next episode. That's a wrap on this episode. We covered a lot of ground today, from the founding myths that shaped Rome's self-image, to the class structures that ran one of history's most powerful empires, to the slow, deliberate adoption of coinage as a tool for conquest and control. If this is the kind of history you want more of, The best thing you could do is leave a 5-star review and pass it along to someone who would appreciate it. A word of mouth is everything for an independent show like this one. You can also support the show directly by going to patreon.com/historyofmoneybankingtrade or visit our website at moneybankingtrade.com. Until next time, I'm Mike D, and this has been the History of Money, Banking, and Trade.